Willkommen zurück. Ja, wir haben den
Welcome
nächsten
back.
Referenten
And we have with us our next speaker.
für alle, die wieder eine Übersetzung
For all those, again, who need translation, please make sure you click the globe symbol at the bottom of the Zoom screen and select German if you need translation into German, and then you'll hear the interpreters interpreting into German.
und der Christian
Right, and Christian, sitting next to me here, will introduce our next speaker.
Hi. Die nächste Referentin
Our
ist
next speaker is Julie Maier. She's also from the United States, just like Tim, from California. And her topic is communication and a communication-rich environment. What helps to set up good communication? On her background, she's a pedagogical officer with the CDBS in California. That's the Californian Deafblind Service, and she's for many years been working with children with the CHARGE syndrome. Enjoy.
Thank you so much, Christian. I appreciated that introduction, and I just wanted to say Guten Abend, hello to everyone. I'm very honored to have been invited to speak at this conference, and I'm very happy that so many families and professionals have come together to learn together this weekend. So as Christian told you, when I spoke to Claudia a couple years ago when the planning was occurring for when we thought we would all be in person last summer, we talked about some different topics that we could talk about. And one that I told her that I had done different presentations on and shared a lot of information about here in California, both with families and also teachers that I teach. I teach at a university, San Francisco State, training teachers who are working with children in special education. This was communication and practices and structures that help was a topic that I thought would be useful. So what my focus on this presentation is really thinking about children who are at an emergent communication stage. So children who have not yet acquired symbolic language. So they're not using spoken language, they're not using signed communication, they're still learning to communicate. So that will be the focus, and really thinking about how adults in the child's environment can be responsive to the child's attempts at every level to communicate. And so what I'm going to focus on are 4 different things today. I'm going to focus on first I'll start with the importance of just connection. Next, I'll talk about just how communication develops. And then I'm going to move into talking about trust and routines and how those are such important structures and conditions for building communication with children who are emerging communicators who have disabilities. And then finally, I'm going to talk about reciprocity and interaction, so that balance that occurs in truly reciprocal relationships, which is what we're looking for. So I'll start with this slide. It's a quote from another teacher of the deafblind here in the United States, who actually was one of the teachers who trained me many decades ago, I guess 3 now, 30 years ago. But she didn't say this 30 years ago, but what she said, Lori, she said, all humans crave connection, communication, the exchange of ideas and feelings and thoughts is a way of creating connections. I believe this is true for all children. I think all children, regardless of their disability, their skills or abilities, they are looking for connection. And in fact, brain research tells us this. So neurodevelopmental research, or research thinking about how the brain works, has found that actually humans were born with this desire and this need to build attachments. And there's a good reason for that. We're seeking this emotional safety so that we can kind of construct and figure out the world and how the world works and how the people in our environment connect with us and how we relate with them. And this goes way, way back. This goes back to when, humans were just developing, because the world was not as safe then, right? People lived outdoors and There was no electricity. There was not even fire then. So humans, as they were developing, had to get really good at knowing what was safe in the world and where they could find that kind of security and safety. This occurs for all children. Typically, developing infants and young children are going to use communication behavior in some way to communicate with people. So this is not something that's unique to children who have a disability like Charge, who might not be acquiring language as quickly. This is true for all children. They are going to use behavior first. Now, for many children with Charge syndrome, they may use behaviors rather than spoken language or signed communication for many years longer than a typically developing sibling or peer. And some may never develop symbolic language, but they are still going to communicate and use behaviors to make connections because they need that to thrive in the world. So I have another quote here that I wanted to share with you. And it's from Dr. Susan Zydick, and she is a developmental psychologist at the University of Dundee in Scotland. And she's done a lot of work with looking at the relationships between babies and their care providers. And again, looking at the brains and the neural connections in the brains and the ways that babies come into the world ready to, through all of their sensory systems, make connections with other people and to figure out who are the dependable people in their lives. So what she wrote is, babies arrive with brains programmed to seek emotional and physical contact with other people. So that's important. They're seeking both emotional and physical contact. Over the first year, we discover who in our world is good at noticing our need for emotional contact and who isn't in tune with our needs. A baby's rapidly developing brain keeps track of these patterns, and he or she builds them into expectations they're forming about relationships more generally. So this, to me, and when I heard Susan speak about this at a symposium in Texas several years ago, and to me, it was what was really, really powerful is these early effects of making these connections, these emotional connections, are going to have an impact on their relationships throughout their lives. So it's a very, very important time. Now, if you notice what she says, is she says they're good at noticing this. And so young children, how they're noticing this is they're noticing other people's responses. And so for a sighted and a hearing child, so children who are using their vision and hearing, they're going to notice that because they're seeing things and hearing things. They're going to hear the responses from their care provider and their parents. They're going to see someone approaching them or someone noticing that they are, happy or that they're upset or that they need their diaper changed or they're hungry. For children who don't have full vision and hearing, like children with Charge syndrome, we're going to really need to think about contact and touch. And those are the ways that we're going to make those connections. And we'll continue to keep talking about that. And I'm so sorry, Claudia, I just realized that I have not been saying next slide, please. So I'm going to do that right now. So next slide, please. And I will try to remember that now. My apologies. So on this next slide, I'm going to be talking about building that connection through communication. So I want to first think about how this happens with typically developing children. So children learn how to communicate incidentally because they're paying attention to what's happening in the world around them. They're watching and listening to others. They are not planning or intending to learn specific communication skills. It just is happening because they're engaging in tasks and activities and watching and imitating other people's. But all children will use facial gestures, vocalizations, gestures such as movement or pointing to initiate these responses from others. So with very young children and babies, who you'll see that they're communicating with is a very small circle of trusted adults. They're communicating with people that they know can interpret their behavior because they're not using symbolic language yet. So, and that will quickly respond to those attempts. So young children are recognizing and noticing who is noticing their need for affirmation, that I'm doing something now, that I'm nervous and frightened right now because a new person just walked into the room, or someone's trying to pick me up who I don't know, or I'm happy now because someone's tickling my feet, or I'm feeling grumpy now because I'm feeling hungry, and so I'm crying a little bit. So children are using lots of different behaviors, and with very young children, there's a small circle of people who they're expecting are going to respond to that. So that's important to remember too, because that may remain true for children with charge for a longer period of time. Next slide, please. Okay. So let's think a little bit about incidental learning again. So I talked about how children incidentally learn how to, wave bye-bye, or point to something because they're watching that's how other people get attention. It's the same way that concepts are developed for young children and all children as throughout life, but rapidly, a lot of things about how the world works, how people in the world interact with each other, what they do, the relationships between people, but also relationships between things, how they're similar or different, how things work. Children learn by watching and listening. So this is something that's difficult for a child with charge if they have both vision and hearing loss. They're missing these visual and auditory cues that other children rely on. So, and we have to realize that they are not learning things as quickly many times because they just don't have the same access. They're not getting the same information visually and auditorily. So we're going to think of other ways to give them some of that information through touch, maybe through an enhancing visual access, auditory access. And the other thing about communications and concepts is that they're learned, and practiced in everyday use. So we're not going to think about communication skills and teaching them at a separate time. Teaching a child maybe how to turn pages in a book and just practicing that, or practicing how to wave hello or goodbye at a time when it's not already occurring. So there's opportunities all the time to be building communication skills just in every routine and activity that you're doing throughout the day. And I have some notes here that I wanted to remind myself about, just examples of thinking about incidental learning and how important it is, and the kinds of things that kids learn just from watching and seeing. So kids learn, that milk belongs in the refrigerator at your home. They learn how to climb a play structure at the park because they're watching other children do it, and they kind of decide when they feel like they're going to be ready. They learn when someone else says they're out on a walk with their family and a neighbor says hello to wave back. So they might at school learn how to hang up their backpack on their hook and put in their work in their completed basket. All these things kids just learn incidentally. So for a child with charge, we're going to really have to think about how we can provide structures, routines, and opportunities that they can practice these things and learn these things more directly. And the same is true for communication. Next slide, please. So in terms of charge syndrome, some things that I think it's really important that we realize that there are some challenges to forming these connections that I've been talking about. But I still believe, and I think research in charge syndrome has shown that these children still very, very much desire connection. And they want to be able to make these positive connections with other people. But there are these barriers. So what is important for adult family members, other care providers, educators in their life is to understand these barriers and identify and implement practices that will help to diminish them. They won't completely go away, but there are ways that we can help to diminish them by the ways that we respond. So vision loss is one thing. if they have vision loss, they're going to miss those facial expressions, the nonverbal gestures, such as reaching for something, waving, and just opportunities to learn social skills incidentally. So that could be a reason why you don't see some social skills developing as quickly. If there's hearing loss, they may not understand spoken language. They may need a visual language, sign communication. That may be a different language than other family members are using, their peers are using. It's hard to make connections then if you're using a different language. And then we know that there's multisensory needs with children with CHARGE. So there's balance issues, standing, walking, movement. All these could be difficult. They may have unusual postures and positions that they're using out of necessity in terms of sensory regulation. Those things, again, can be a barrier sometimes if someone doesn't understand them or if they're not willing to accommodate them. And then finally, and this is an important one, and I think is important for professionals, educators to really understand, that medical issues and hospitalizations, especially for children with CHARGE there can be a lot of it, and there can be lengthy visits when they're very young. This is going to limit opportunities to make those early connections that are so important in a child's life, and especially positive ones. Next slide, please. So there's no way in this presentation to tell you all the practices or structures that would work for every child with CHARGE, because children with CHARGE are so unique and there's such a range of abilities. But one thing I did want to point out on this slide is that in all children, expressive communication is delayed. All children understand receptively communication earlier. So they understand what people are saying, what those nonverbal cues mean, or if they're using signed communication, they understand that first before they express it themselves. So that should be something that shouldn't, don't be worried if you don't see them happening at the same time. Expressive, so the child communicating to you and you communicating to the child and the child understanding receptively. Expressive communication will be delayed. The other thing is, remember that all children start out with pre-intentional behavior. So all children just start out with behaviors that we, the adults in their lives, apply meaning to. So that's important to remember when we're thinking about children with CHARGE syndrome. The other thing is that because of there are different anomalies and abilities, we can't generalize skill levels to each child. Some children with CHARGE will acquire symbolic language. They will either develop spoken or visual assigned communication. Others might advance along the continuum and develop more and more skills, but never get to a symbolic language. And so in that case, you're going to remain at the level that they're at. And for some children, just intentional behaviors and unconventional communication might be the most effective way to communicate. So that will be always very important for the family to share that information with educators, letting them know, what does this behavior mean? When they do this, they're telling you that, and things like that. Next slide, please. Okay, so good. We're on behavior and communication. So I know that you already learned a lot about behavior today. You were fortunate enough to hear from Dr. Hartshorn in Michigan. And so hopefully at the end of that, you had a much better idea of understanding that all behavior is communication and that all behavior has a purpose and function. But one thing I think that is interesting to think about, and this is how I like to think about the type of behavior, one function of behavior is to gain attention of other people. So attention seeking. And oftentimes that's when we see an unusual or unexpected behavior, they're called attention seeking because we think that the individual is doing that just to get the adult's attention. And I'm thinking that perhaps a better description of that could be connection seeking. So certainly the child is trying to get your attention, but instead of just thinking that they're trying to get your attention because they want you to just look at them, or they want you to say something, or they want you to do something, think about it. They actually might be trying to connect with you and say, join me in something. Let's do something together. So that's a really big shift in terms of how we interpret what the behavior is. So an example I thought of is if a child takes a toy and they keep dropping it off the table or dropping it off their tray or tossing a toy. And many times we might think, oh, he's just looking for attention, and then either say like, stop that right now, or that's not what we do with the toy, or let's play with it, or decide to ignore it. Sometimes attention seeking will say, they're just looking for attention, let's ignore it, they'll stop. But that's a powerful message then you're sending to the child. And so they may then try a different behavior to, again, seek that connection. So I think it's instead, when possible, to look at these behaviors as actually an interaction opportunity. Maybe the child's telling you they want to play, we can engage in some game with the toy. You don't want the child to keep throwing the toy, but maybe there's a way that you can then go over and play with them with the toy together and turn it into an opportunity to be connected versus just simply giving them brief, intermittent attention for the behavior. Next slide, please. I know in a couple of days you'll be hearing from Rob Last from Australia, and he'll also be talking about communication. And I'm sure he'll mention all of these, but in terms of this session today, I'm going to be talking about modes, so different types or forms of communication, because there's a variety that you'll see with children with charge. I'm going to be talking about reasons for communication, so the function of the behavior. And then we'll talk a little bit about rates, and so how often an individual communicates, but especially thinking about initiation. The practices and structures I'm going to talk about should be things that can help you increase those rates of initiation. Next slide, please. So modes of communication. There are a few here on the slides that I wanted to speak about. Some modes you may see with children with charge would be spoken language or signed language. You also will oftentimes see combined children using gestures. There still might be some touch cues or tactile sign language used if the person has very low vision. Objects can be used to represent something, to represent an activity, to represent a person, to represent the actual object themselves. And then some children, if their vision is good enough, will make photos, and picture symbols can be a way that they may communicate both receptively to get information, but also to show you something that they'd like to do. Now, many children with charge will use more than one mode, and the modes will change as they grow and develop. So a child may start out with object cues, but as they start to learn that object cue represents a person or an activity or an event, then you may be able to take a photo of it or show a picture symbol of it. And so the child's going to be moving up in terms of their communication skill levels. If they are then starting to use some signed communication or spoken language, that would again be more indication that they're moving up. What's important is that you're communicating with your child or the student in your class in their language. So the key to them developing language skills and interaction skills is that you are using the level that they're at that time, and then modeling the next level up. Next slide, please. So I wanted to take a look at these three particular levels of communication. And these, and so typically developing children will move through all these levels. They'll do it more quickly. And as I said earlier, for some children with charge, they may not reach the symbolic level, the level of spoken or signed communication. So what's important is that you're identifying the child's current level of behavior and that you're meeting them there. So pre-intentional behaviors. So if a child is just demonstrating pleasure or displeasure, but there's no meaning to it, that they're an example is a child that's crying because they either need their diaper changed or they're hungry or they're scared. They're not really directing that to another person, and you're going to apply meaning to it. Pre-symbolic is what you'll see toddlers using, typically developing toddlers, and then for many children with charge syndrome, you'll see them stay at this level a little bit longer, and maybe until the time when they're entering school. So, and you'll see them using gestures, and sometimes there'll be gestures that everyone will be able to recognize, such as a wave or pointing to something. But other times there'll be things that are very unique to and idiosyncratic to that particular child. And in that case, again, it will be important for the adults in their lives to really know what that means. Touch cues. So that could be another way that you're giving information to a child. So maybe if you're going to pick them up, you're putting your hands underneath their arms and pulling up 2 times lightly to let them know that we're going to be going up, or touching them maybe on their waist because you're going to be changing their diaper. Letting them feel object cues, body movements, eye gaze, and then remembering maladaptive behaviors. So behaviors that maybe are not expected, unusual, might not be things that we want the child to engage in for a long time because they might be harmful or they might not be very socially acceptable. So it might be something that won't help with connections with other people. But remember, those behaviors, when a child's first learning to communicate, are expressing something. There's a purpose for them to do that, and there's a meaning to it. So we have to respond to it. And then finally, symbolic is spoken or signed communication that the individuals can use back and forth with each other. Next slide, please. So what I love this quote by Dr. Susan Bruce. She teaches at Boston College in the special education department. She's worked with children with multiple disabilities, including deafblindness and CHARGE for decades, and she's trained just hundreds of teachers. And she really is one of the key researchers that has looked a lot at early communication for children who are deafblind. And I want to share this quote about symbolic communication. So she wrote, "Learning the meaning of symbols is not enough to ensure quality interactions. A rich history of early communication opportunities prepares children to successfully use symbols to communicate, express thoughts, and gain access to the thoughts of others." So I'm sharing this with you because I think this is a very important statement about remembering that there's lots of different reasons and purposes for communication. So we don't just want to teach children to be able to identify an object and be able to name it or label it. We're not just thinking about labeling. We really are looking for opportunities for meaningful communication, for conversation opportunities, for rich interaction between two people. So it's not just about identifying a particular symbol. So, showing the child their diaper and they know it's diaper. You can have a conversation about that. Then you could show them their diaper and say, it's time for us to go change our diaper. Are you ready now? Can you help me? Let's go. There's a lot of vocabulary that could be used. There's a lot of concepts that can be taught. Susan Bruce always talks about, if you use a calendar system with a child, that every time you go to the calendar to retrieve the next item or object, that's an opportunity for a conversation. So we really want to think about using symbols within, as I said earlier, everyday contexts, so that kids are really learning what the meaning of this is versus just being taught how to simply label something. It's helping them to connect with other people. Next slide, please. Okay, good. And I see there's an interpreter switch. Okay. So if I were to put this whole presentation into a nutshell on one slide, this would be it. It's really important that we remember that skills shouldn't just be taught or practiced in isolation. There needs to be a purpose and a meaning, especially for a child who is delayed maybe in their development, whether that's because of the multisensory losses, because there's an intellectual disability perhaps as well, or just because for so many children with CHARGE, their early years are spent so much time just with medical issues and health issues that we can't start working on these things. So What's most important is that we first are focusing on the relationship. So the outer circle, the dark blue circle, relationship. We're thinking about trusted, responsive parents, care providers, educators. That's what's important. We're thinking about that trusted relationship. That's who the child is going to learn the skills with. This is going to give them the secure base and the confidence to develop these skills. The next thing that we're going to think about is what are those shared experiences that we can have together so that we can join the child in. So engaging in activities that are going to require interaction by both partners. So it's not just us commenting on something the child's doing, it's us engaging in the activity together. And we're going to be following the child's interest and lead. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, why that's important. We're going to be sharing emotions and thoughts. We're going to help the child kind of learn the language and learn the movements and learn the expressions of emotions that people think about, ways to share those thoughts. Because remember, they may be missing those things because of their limited vision and hearing. We're going to ask questions when we're doing this shared experience. We're going to build vocabulary. We're going to build on motivation. So some examples I thought of would be like if you could join children together and playing with bubbles, and you could be, taking turns blowing bubbles. You could be laughing about the bubbles that pop on their nose or on their hands, or them trying to pop them themselves. You could be talking about big and small. You could have a playful bedtime routine. So a routine that you have for bedtime, but make it kind of fun and playful. Reading a book together that has a simple text or a repeating storyline. So maybe Going on a Bear Hunt, that book, or The Very Hungry Caterpillar by Eric Carle. I know a lot of people know that book. In a lot of languages, but books that have a repeating storyline that then the child can join in. So you can be practicing skills then within that shared experience. So the skills are not worked on outside of context. We're practicing them, we're reinforcing them in a joint experience with a trusted person that the child knows well and understands their communication. Next slide, please. So on this slide, I just want to share some different environmental conditions and actions that adults can take that have a positive influence on the development of child's communication skills. And this was taken from a really nice article that was written about 15 years ago by Susan Bruce and Peggy Malloy at the National Center on Deaf Blindness in the United States. And it's just a few pages long, but it has some really good suggestions. So they're all on this slide, and I wanted to focus on these throughout the rest of the presentation. But first, highly responsive adults, which I've been stressing already. But then thinking about the activities that you do, experiences that might involve action and movement, again, can be a way to really motivate the child, but also to teach them things about concepts, about how things work together, about you could attach vocabulary to it. So you could practice things like fast, slow, up, down, all through movement and action. And then think about the emotional impact of activities and materials. So again, that goes back to the child's interest and the child's preferences for the activities and materials you're using. And look for things that are really meaningful and interesting to the child. And they may not be things that you're always interested in, but you can become interested in them as you join in this joint play together. And then finally, not finally, but play is another element that to consider, and we'll talk about later. Regular routines, we'll talk in a few minutes about how important those are. And then, of course, not forgetting that for children with multisensory issues, we're going to be thinking about trying every sense that we can to get information in. And really maximizing the use of vision and hearing that they say. So we're thinking about as many senses as possible, and then engaging in activities that the child prefers. And another example I was thinking of was, I talked about the example earlier where a child that loves to throw balls or throw toys, and we're thinking, oh, we don't really want that to be the game we're playing. You could change it to, if you don't want heavy toys or balls to be thrown, you could get silk scarves and have the child practice throwing those, and those could be, and you could talk a lot about movement and action that way. Or you could get a big basket or a hoop and have the child instead try to like direct their toss or throw. So there's ways that we can kind of think about using things that are very interesting and fun for the child, but teaching them new skills on top of it and adding communication opportunities as well as vocabulary. Next slide, please. So for the remainder of the presentation, I'm going to focus on how do we then build communication through that connection. And we've already talked about trusted relationships, but we'll talk about routines. We'll talk about physical spaces that can encourage communication. We'll think about sensory conditions, always, of course, for children with CHARGE syndrome. We'll talk about child's interest to plan activities, as I mentioned already, and then focusing on reciprocal interactions. And the final thing that I'll talk about is just having time and patience, because that is definitely something that is required, because it will take more time. So let's move on to the next slide, which is building trust. So children, babies from teens, they sense how the person that's interacting with them is feeling. And I think this is true for individuals that I've met with CHARGE syndrome as well. And I think they also really understand expectations that other people hold for their abilities. So I think it's important that you demonstrate respect and patience with the child as they're learning to communicate. You hold expectations that the child can and wants to communicate at whatever level they can do that. And that you notice and respond to messages that the child's sending to you, and that you apply meaning to that. So the child may be reaching for an item, and then you can say, "Oh, you want your doll. I see you want your doll." Or they might be reaching for that, and you might apply the meaning like, "Oh, are you wondering what that is, or whose doll that is, or where this came from?" So you can help them kind of with wondering questions as well. And then we're going to be responsive to all initiatives. Again, remembering that it might be unusual behaviors, but it also could be small gestures or a change in eye gaze, paying attention to those things. So, and that you're going to be following the child's lead and their pace for interactions. I think for many children with CHARGE, and again, I'm not a parent of a child with CHARGE, so I'm not an expert like many of you in the audience, but what I've noticed is that many of them seek this kind of continuity in relationships. They get very attached to people that they know well and who know them. And I think that's because they know that they have an assurance that those people will understand their message and will be able to adjust the interaction and be able to offer support if they don't understand the child, right? So it's someone that can kind of figure out, I know you're trying to tell me something, and even if you don't always know what the child's trying to tell you, they know that you're a partner that at least is going to make the attempt to try to figure it out. On the next slide, I want to show a video. It's a very short video. It's 1 minute long, and there's no language used in it. So Claudia is going to get that ready. And Claudia, before you start it, let me just say a couple things. So I want you to just pay attention to who's leading this interaction. Pay attention to, this is a young girl, and she'll be sitting on the couch, and her uncle's going to come and sit on the couch. So it's someone she knows. So that's something that's important because it's what I just spoke about. And just watch how he interacts with her and think about what he's doing that's affirming her initiations. And that ask yourself, is he following her lead? So that's good, Claudia. You can start the video. Okay, thank you, Claudia. So what I love about that is it's following her pace. So at first she doesn't do anything when he sits down, but then when she does reach out, you can tell that she recognizes who it is. And then they've got a relationship. So he starts this tickling game, tickling her toes. And then she's guiding a lot of the conversation that they're having, this nonverbal conversation through touch. She is guiding it by just through moving his hands to different places, letting him know, I want more tickles. Then he tries to, I think, kind of tickle up by her head or tickle her chest. And that's when she starts to move away like, no, I don't like that. You see, this is a game that many kids play with their families. Children play with their parents, but they use language. They'll be like, no, stop it. Or that's, or laugh out loud. But she's clearly, this is positive. And then when she gets up and she's maybe ready for this game to end, she pulls him along. So she wants him to come along with her. That is a great example of connection, communication leading to connection. I just love it. Okay. So now we were on to the next slide, which is importance of routines. Okay. So I said I was going to talk about routines. I cannot stress enough how important routines are for children who are deafblind, and especially for children with CHARGE syndrome. They really thrive with routines, and for good reason. I would too if I had limited vision and hearing. The world would make a lot more sense if things were predictable. So this is a very simple thing that adults can do to support a child's learning in terms of concept development and communication. So routines are going to give the child a chance to learn concepts and skills that they didn't learn incidentally, that they have to learn directly through practice. And I'll give you a really good example of that. I know many of you in Germany maybe have been following the Jonas cooking lessons, but that is a tremendous example of Jonas learning a lot of things that maybe another child could have learned earlier through watching and listening, but he needed practice to do these things. And because of that practice, he's now able to cook meals for his family and and feel really, really great about it, right? So routines provide that structure and predictability. That predictability, because the child knows what to expect, they can start to anticipate what the next step will be or how someone's going to respond, and they can increase their initiations. Remember, we talked about rate with communication. We want to increase initiations and then allow them to be an active participant and then feel really confident and independent. And so routines are definitely something that you want to remember, and they have they're an important element in terms of promoting communication. So the next slide, please. So when we're thinking about routines, I think the other thing to think about, and as parents and also as educators, especially with young children, is thinking about all routines have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But for predictable routines that we're teaching to children, we want to make sure that the beginning, middle, and end are very clear. So there might be symbol cues or particular signs or phrases or vocabulary that we use always at the beginning, the middle, and the end to help the child kind of understand the whole routine. Many times we do things for children. We don't allow them to participate in every step of the routine. I know myself, when my children were young, many times I did just let them do part of the routine because it was faster for me to do it myself. But we really need to think about if we do it for them, then we're missing out on these opportunities for them to learn these concepts and skills. So predictable routines, for an example, might be bath time, where we're undressing for the bath while the water is filling up. So the child knows that bath time's happening because they see the water being filled up, but then they're also undressing. playing and washing in the bath, and then drying their body and putting on PJs. That's all part of the routine, and the child participates in each step, and there's ways that they can start to anticipate the next step or action. For school, it might be your arrival routine in the morning, or the morning class meeting, or preparing for lunch. There's lots of different routines, and just think about each step in it and what would be ways that the child can participate. And then you can make slight changes in steps in a routine, and that's where routines can be really powerful in terms of communication. Next slide, please. When I originally was going to do this presentation, it was just going to be for families. So the next couple slides just talk about family routines, but just think about how you could apply it to school as well. But the first thing is to identify routines that happen for your family. And if right now you don't think, oh, I don't have that many in my family, in my home that my children participate in, whether it's a child with charge or without, if they're siblings without charge, just consider establishing more. So thinking about, could they participate in meal times, dressing times, bath time, bedtime story? And then initially you'll want routines to happen at the same time and in the same space. That's going to help build that predictability and structure. And then when possible, if you're away from home, you're on vacation, try to still kind of follow the routines as much as possible. And then for teachers, what I wanted to point out for you professionals in the audience, it's just important to remember that children with charge may not have learned as many routines in their home in their early years as typically developing kids. So they may need more direct instruction to learn and practice these skills, just because the early years are spent so much time just managing medical issues and health. So they may need more time to practice steps in the routine, or you may have to modify routines. Next slide, please. And then just wanted to stress again, thinking about how to include the child as much as possible in routine and give them, even so if they can't do an entire routine, what's a small part of the routine they can do? So maybe they can't get dressed all by themselves, but maybe they can do the part where they pull up their pants. Or maybe they can't put all the toys away, or where the toys belong, they can't reach that shelf, but they could help to put them in the basket. Or they may not be able to wash themselves properly all the way, but they could help hold the sponge. And in school, it could be, maybe they hang up their coat and backpack on a hook, but someone kind of assists them to get it up there. Or they may push a switch to start the music for kids to do a freeze dance or a dancing game at school on the play yard or something. And so as the child engages in the routine, another opportunity for communication is then you're going to apply meaning. You're going to help them know that, when you see them giggling, that means something. That means I'm having fun, I'm happy. Or when I'm jumping, like you could apply to, oh, I can see you're excited, or reaching, I want that. So help to, again, build the vocabulary, build meaning. Next slide, please. And then there's lots of opportunities for communication and routine if you kind of change routines a little bit. So you can look for opportunities where the child's going to have to comment or request more, or request to continue, or request to stop, or ask a question. So you could change or delay the routine to see if the child notices and lets you know and corrects you. You could forget some material that's needed in the routine, and then will the child ask for it if that missing material is gone? You could forget a step, so be kind of silly, or skip the child's turn and see what do they do. Are they like, hey, wait a minute, or my turn? So try to look for those ways where they're going to have to initiate. But the key thing is to make, you do not want to distress the child. So this shouldn't be something that's causing them anxiety. So keep it fun and humorous. Next slide, please. On this slide, I just wanted to talk briefly about how much spaces can also encourage communication. So, and again, for children who have low vision and hearing and other sensory issues, it's really important that we have this predictability, that things are organized, that there's visual, auditory, and maybe physical enhancements that would support the child to use the things, and also thinking about limiting distractions. And if the child can easily navigate, find, look for favorite items, things like that. So this is just a really simple structure that adults can employ to make it easier for the child to engage in their environment. So it's not so much of them waiting for something to happen, but they're actually acting on the environment, initiating communication, things like that. Next slide, please. On this slide, I just wanted to stress once again the importance that for a child with charge, with multisensory issues, we're really going to be thinking about connecting through all available senses. So sighted and hearing children will use their primary senses to get information. For a child who is low vision or has hearing loss, we're going to think about using, touch, maybe hand under hand support, and really and thinking about how we can highlight the materials we're using or the activities, so that we might increase the sound. We might make sure things are very visually stimulating. You see a picture here of a young child with charge, and she's in her father's lap and they're drumming. And so, but he's giving her, she's not ready to just bang on the drum herself. She's interested, but he's there to put his hand, he's giving her hand under hand support. He's waiting till she's showing that she's ready to continue. He's waiting for some kind of response from her. So just remembering how important that is to watch for the child's signal that they're ready, that they need more time or they're finished. Next slide, please, Claudia. And then finally, the last thing I want to say before we talk about reciprocal interactions is just how important it is to focus on the child's interests to promote communication. And when I think of this, I think of David Brown and I think of Jan van Dijk immediately. It's so much easier to engage a child if they are participating in something that they already do, something that they like, something that they're interested in. All children are going to be more interested in engaging in something that they like and avoiding things that they don't prefer. So if you're looking for engagement and interaction, you need to follow the child's interest. And I think Rob last on Sunday will be talking more about this too, about passions. But some questions I think you could ask yourself are, what interests or seems to motivate the child? What types of toys, materials, activities do they prefer? What senses do you think they use the best? What sensory experiences are they seeking out? And then maybe for children that are using some spoken language or signed language, what topics do they prefer to talk about? What people do they like to be around? What spaces do they like to be in? But what I really want to encourage you not to do is just to not stop at, well, I don't think she's really interested in anything. I've heard teachers say that, educators say that. I've sometimes had families have a difficult time identifying what they're interested in. And in that case, I think you really need to really look at all the messages the child's sending. Are there particular movements that they enjoy? Are there particular sounds? Are there particular textures? Are there particular people? So really, really think about, there's something that interests everyone. Sometimes we just have to look a little harder. So finally, next slide, we're going to talk about quality interactions. And we've talked a lot already about building trust, but I want to talk about these 4 other areas: the serve and return, joint attention, play, and reaching out. And I think I have time to get through all of this. So next slide. This slide I want to talk a little bit about this idea of harmonious interactions or balanced reciprocal interactions, or this serve and return. So it's really important that the communication partner that's with the child is recognizing all the child's signals and initiations, and that when they recognize it, they affirm and respond to it in a way that the child recognizes. So again, you remember, this might need to be because you're doing this through touch if the child can't hear that hear your response or see your response. And then also the adult might need to make changes to the environment that are going to increase responses. The key thing you need to know is that it's your responsibility. As adults, it's your responsibility to help to create and maintain these harmonious interactions until the child develops symbolic language. So if you think of this interaction like a game of tennis, a serve and return, that's a term that we're using more in the field of deafblindness, and they use in early childhood development as well, is that the care provider, the adult, notices the child's focus of attention. And so you notice that they're serving something and you share in that, and then you return it by either supporting or encouraging it. and then you help to give language to it. You build some connections that way, and then you take turns and you wait. And you try to keep that interaction going back and forth, being the whole time very responsive to when the child is telling you, I'm done, or I've had enough. So there's a photograph on this slide, and it's a little boy with charge. He's sitting in the lap of a teacher at a preschool, and there's a guide dog at the school. And he's very nervous about meeting this dog, but he's willing to reach out and let the dog sniff on his hand and to pet her a little bit while he's in the secure lap of his teacher, who's not forcing him to touch the dog, isn't calling the dog over too quickly, just waiting till he's ready to reach out. And then as he is, they're petting the dog together. She's expressing both through, he uses a Baha so he can hear a little bit. And she's speaking to, the side where he can hear well. She's expressing some words, but also through her body language that they're excited. When he's ready to pull back, she pulls back. So that's a good example of serve and return. Next slide, please. And the key thing, and this is this information is from Bernadette Vanden Tillert, who has just done so much in terms of thinking about reciprocal interactions and positive self-image for children who are deaf-blind. But what she really speaks about is there's so much more than just building communication skills. Again, when you're affirming a child and responding to their initiative, you're strengthening their identity. You're letting them know that their action can influence other people, that someone notices and will respond. They're going to feel more confident in terms of expressing themselves and initiating more. And it also is going to help them develop a better idea of who they are. And so they're going to feel very positive about themselves. So the way that you notice, affirm, and respond to the child is going to help to strengthen their identity of themselves and their abilities in a really positive way, which is going to lead to them wanting to then share and reach out to more people in the world. Next slide, please. So next is joint attention. And so joint attention occurs when two people are paying attention to each other and the same thing at the same time. And they both know that. They both know they're paying attention to the same thing at the same time. That's really important. So for you at home when you're doing a routine with a child, or when you're doing a routine or instructing in school, it's really important that you think about attention. You think about what is the child attending to, and notice what they're attending to, and show interest in that, and take the time that you need to affirm that, and to then have a conversation, whether it's nonverbal or if it's with spoken or signed language. And there's a photograph here of that same young girl with charge who, this is a couple years later, she's sitting here with me, but we're going to plant some plants together. But she needed to spend a lot of time noticing all the plants, how they were different, the different colors, picking out her plant. She didn't do this as quickly as the other kids at this event, just grabbing a plant and putting it in the pot. It took time, and we had to give her that time. And then when you're going to introduce something new to a child and it's not what they're preferring to do, you need to consider how you're going to get them to first attend and notice. So give them time for that. But then how are you going to keep their attention? Because joint attention is important. Both people need to know that they're both still attending to the same thing. I think sometimes we forget that. I've just a few more slides and very little time. So just this slide kind of speaks for itself, but play is a great way to promote communication. There's so many opportunities. If you watch typically developing children, they're talking, they're commenting, they're asking questions, making choices. Those opportunities are there for a child with CHARGE syndrome as well. So use play. Demonstrate that you're sharing in the child's interest in the way that they're playing when you join them. It's a great way to practice turn taking. And there's lots of opportunities for the child to take the lead and to make those choices. And then finally, just remembering play's fun. Play's not work. It's fun, and it's a great avenue for bringing in siblings, other family members, or peers. So keep it joyful, keep it fun. Next slide. So I mentioned this earlier in the presentation about time, but I just wanted to remind you once again that you're going to need to be patient with your child or the student in your class as well as yourself. Okay, so it's going to take longer to develop these skills. to complete routines or to practice communication within routines, you'll have to add that time, than it does with other children. You need to provide the child the time they need to receive a message and then consider a response, and then for you to respond using the pace and rhythm that they're using. So we saw that example with Lauren earlier and her uncle. So follow that pace. And so sometimes that's going to mean you're going to extend time for a particular routine. And then really the other thing I want to encourage you in terms of thinking about communication and time is really practice empathy, and just think about how you would feel or how you have felt when you felt not understood or misunderstood by others. And sometimes when we don't provide the time, what can happen is it can become really, really tiring and frustrating for the child. So take breaks when you need, and also, appreciate the effort and energy that it takes to result in fixing communication breakdowns, okay? And then finally, and I'm going to go just a couple minutes over, but I do want to finish with these last couple slides about reaching out because it's so important. So I'd like to end again by returning to this idea of connections. Beyond developing a strong and positive relationship with your child or student and strengthening their skills in communicating, a really powerful outcome of paying attention to attachment and serve and return and joint attention is that the child develops this positive identity, and they're going to now feel more confident to reach out to others. So this is going to expand opportunities and experiences for them. So all these things you're doing is going to expand their world, which is a great thing, I think. If we think about typically developing children, this is a natural progression in childhood and as they move into adulthood. They acquire language and social skills because they're interacting with trusted adults who care for them when they're very young. But as they grow older, they start to disengage with those adults, and the connections they form are more with same-age peers. And that becomes a really important part of their social and emotional development. This can be difficult for some children and youth with CHARGE. So these early positive relationships with trusted, responsive adults can really be that, provide that additional support that they're going to need for that social and emotional development. This almost final slide is that when that happens, when the child starts to reach out more to other people, to peers, people outside of the family, your role changes. Now you're going to, you provided that secure base. Now you're going to transition to be more of a coach or mentor for your child and their peers, helping them understand each other, maybe interpreting how your child communicates, or helping the child understand what the peers are doing and why they're doing that. And then just being a supportive advocate. And there's lots of ways that we could be a whole nother session talking about this particular topic, but I know many of you have seen things about personal passports or sharing all about me books before, communication dictionaries. That can be helpful. And then I just want to, next slide is my final slide. And I just wanted to end with this quote from Al Mensky. He's a Canadian community activist, philosopher, and he does a lot around community organizing, and has thought a lot about the importance of social interaction in terms of humans being very social creatures and relationships, and how these relationships impact our satisfaction in terms of the quality of our life. So he wrote, "A good life is a human life. A human life is a social life. The essence of human nature is to be in the company of others. Companionship, fellowship, and connection to others is essential to our well-being." So that is where I will end. On the next slide, you'll see my, and you have this with the handout, I'm assuming, you'll see my contact information. So once again, just thank you very much for attending and listening. And I'd be happy to answer questions. And also, if you feel like you want to reach out after the conference, please do. Okay.